I get it that people like the pop of the tube of cinnamon rolls, but their terrifying reign is over. It's time for a new king, homemade brioche cinnamon rolls. Yeah. Now the first thing you might have noticed if you're already subscribed to me, which by the way if you're not, what are you doing? Go hit that button and subscribe and I will give you 1,000 homemade, no I won't, I'm sorry. But you will get lots of amazing recipes like this one and you get to see my beautiful face. That's a great deal. You're back in the cabinet. A couple of people mentioned the fact that I did not put the camera back in the cabinet. I don't really know what I want to do perspective-wise in this new apartment, but I hope that you like it. This is a great make-ahead recipe of cinnamon rolls. If you're gonna have like a breakfast the next morning and you want cinnamon rolls, then this is a perfect recipe for that. I feel like this recipe just kind of explains itself, so I won't lag on too much with this commentary, and let's go ahead and do the thing in which you're here for. Now, first things first is we're gonna need to bloom our yeast. Now, if you wanna use instant yeast or a sourdough starter, they can be used interchangeably, but the timetable will change. I chose active dry yeast. To do that, you're gonna add 10 grams or 2.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast to 175 grams or 3/4 of a cup of milk that is at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I would consider lukewarm. Now there's a 1/4 cup or 55 grams of granulated sugar that you'll be using in the dough later. Just use a small pinch from that sugar and add that to your yeast mixture just to help kind of get the bloom going. Stir it slightly and let it sit for about 10 minutes or until it turns foamy. Now, alternatively with the sourdough starter, you're literally just gonna add your mature starter, which will be 228 grams of mature starter. You can follow this recipe accordingly if you use mature starter, but just be aware that everything will take longer to rise, etc., so you may wanna do it in a warm environment. Now to get the dough started, you're gonna add 570 grams or 3 3/4 of a cup of bread flour to a stand mixer fitted with a dough hook attachment. Notice how I didn't spill it this time, which is a first for this channel. From there, you're gonna add that 55 grams or a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar that you just took a pinch from earlier, 3 grams or half a teaspoon of fine sea salt. Whisk those ingredients together to get them thoroughly incorporated. Now with your mixer on low speed, add your bloomed active dry yeast mixture or your sourdough starter depending on which you're using, one or the other. Then while mixing, add 4 room temperature eggs, 1 egg at a time while mixing, sort of just giving it a little bit of time in between each egg to sort of incorporate it into the dough. Now you may have to stop it and scrape the bottom a little bit to help coax that dry flour in the bottom up into the dough. Now the dough may seem a tad dry at this point, but don't add any water just yet. First, you're going to add 168 grams or 3/4 of a cup of unsalted butter that is room temp. Make sure that it's softened at room temp, and you're just gonna add that to the mixer while the mixer is going at medium-low speed, 1 spoonful at a time until all of the butter is used. If that doesn't fix the whole dryness problem and it's still a little bit clumpy and dry, then you can add water 1 tablespoon at a time until it comes together. Once all your butter's incorporated and you've got a nice looking dough, you're going to turn your mixer speed up to medium speed and allow it to knead the dough for anywhere between 6 and 10 minutes or until the dough begins to look nice and smooth. Then you're just gonna transfer that dough to another bowl for it to rise. Using your hands, sort of rotate the dough and fold the bottom into itself over and over until you sort of get a rough sort of ball shape. Then add it to your bowl and then contemplate whether or not that bowl is big enough or not. Transfer it to another bowl and then realize that that bowl is actually smaller. Then transfer it to the original bowl, cover it with plastic wrap, and then let it rest for 15 minutes. Once it's rested for 15 minutes, you're gonna perform something called stretch and fold. So to do that, you're gonna grab an edge of the dough carefully with your hand, picking it up, stretching it, and then folding it all the way over to the other side of the dough. Rotate the bowl and repeat that on all 4 corners of the dough until you kind of have a little ball shape and the dough begins to resist a little. Then inevitably transfer it to the large bowl that you had been neglecting the entire time. You know, just a piece of advice, just put it in a big enough bowl. Don't do what I did with that. I transferred that dough like 4 times. Then cover that bowl once more with plastic wrap or a damp towel and let it rest at room temperature for 45 minutes. Then remove your plastic wrap, very lightly flour a work surface, dump your dough out onto the surface, and you're basically gonna do the same thing that you did in the bowl. Grab one corner and then fold it in and hold it in place with one hand, and then just repeat that all the way around the dough until you've sort of encapsulated all the edges and created an evenly shaped ball, as you can see here. Then roll it over so the seam side is facing down, and then using your pinkies sort of drag the dough across the board towards you, and you're creating surface tension by pulling it and sort of allowing the dough to fold up into itself as you're pulling it towards you. Rotate and pull until you get a nice evenly sized ball shape. Transfer it to your neglected bowl, cover it tightly with plastic wrap, and place it in the refrigerator overnight. And magically, it is the next day. Now, at this point, you're going to want to start by making your cinnamon sugar filling for the cinnamon rolls. Now, the recipe for this makes quite a lot of cinnamon sugar. It makes way more than you're going to need for the cinnamon rolls, but I like to make extra so that I have more for future cinnamon rolls. And just, you know, to have around the house. It's nice to have cinnamon sugar in the house, trust me. So you're going to start with 1 cup packed or 200 grams of light brown sugar, 2 tablespoons or 36 grams of ground cinnamon, and then just whisk that together until everything is nice and thoroughly incorporated. Trust me, you will want to make the big batch. You'll thank yourself later. Put it in your oatmeal. Alright, now it's time to assemble it all. Start by moderately flouring a work surface. Carefully scrape and dump your dough out onto your floured work surface. And make sure you're using the dough fresh out of the refrigerator while it's still cold, because that makes this process way easier. Lightly flour a rolling pin in the top of your dough and roll the dough until it is a 1/2 inch thick, sort of rectangle shape, if you can get it into a rectangle. I mean, it doesn't need to be perfect. And if the dough becomes sticky in any areas while you're doing this, just lightly dust it with flour and continue rolling. Once all that's done, you're going to spread 56 grams or 1/4 cup of softened butter all over the surface of the dough, leaving a 1/2 inch border. Then coat the surface of your dough in the cinnamon sugar mix very generously. You're probably going to end up using about 1/3 of your mixture or so. Don't overdo it. If you put too much, you'll know, because when you start to roll it up, it'll spill out the sides. You'll want to coat it in a pretty thick layer though. Just don't use all the cinnamon sugar. Once you've coated the whole piece of dough, leaving a small border, gently and moderately tightly roll the dough all the way up to the top and just lightly seal the bottom so that it doesn't split open too much until you get a nice sort of like log serpent shape. I like to trim the very edges off to make it look a little more even, but that's totally optional. Now, using a serrated knife, cut this log into 1.5 inch thick rounds. Now, you can go a little thinner or a little thicker if you want. Just be aware that the thicker you go, the fatter they'll be, and the thinner you go, they'll be a little smaller. No big deal. Once you've sliced them all, place them on a lightly greased baking sheet, spaced about 1 inch apart from each other. Cover them with an equally sized rim baking sheet or loosely covered in plastic wrap to prevent them from drying out. Obviously, you want to make sure the baking sheet is not actually touching them. The whole point of this is so that they don't dry out while they're proofing. Then place them in a cold oven with the light turned on and allow them to proof for 2 hours or until they're nearly doubled in size. Oh, and don't forget to save that cinnamon sugar for, you know, science. And boom, look at that. Now, once they're fully proofed, you're gonna place them in an oven at 350 degrees for 15 minutes, then rotate the tray and bake for an additional 15 minutes, totaling at 30 minutes or until they are golden brown. Now, while we're waiting for those to bake, we're going to make our cream cheese icing. So you're going to take 3 tablespoons or 42 grams of melted butter and whisk that into 140 grams or 1 cup of powdered sugar. Then add 2 tablespoons or 30 milliliters of whole milk, 3 ounces or 85 grams of cream cheese, and then just whisk all of that until it is thoroughly combined and completely smooth, and you've got cream cheese icing. Now, if it's a little bit too thick, you can always thin it out by adding a little bit of milk, a teaspoon at a time. Be very careful because it'll thin out really quickly. Now, once the cinnamon rolls are done baking, you're just gonna let them cool for 10 minutes before glazing them, and then, you know, after that, I think you know what time it is. And that is it. Homemade brioche cinnamon rolls. If you want to sit down with a tray of cinnamon rolls, not that I did that, but there's nobody else in this house, so I'm not saying that I'm not going to, but I probably will. Don't forget to DM photos of your creations using my recipes to me on Instagram. Especially these cinnamon rolls. I really want to see how these turn out for you guys. I love seeing what you guys are making, and you guys have been sending me so much love on there, and so I really appreciate that. My Instagram is in the description below. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video or you learned something, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you next week.